Alrighty. We are looking, as we said, at Revelation 7. We're still talking about these 144,000. We talked about them last week, trying to kind of wrap our minds around this idea. And I think we have a pretty good picture of what this represents, but let's kind of review, because I know it feels like it's been quite a while, even though it's only been 7 days. But we talked about, as we begun chapter 7, we have, really going back even to chapter 6 and 5, we have this judgment that's being described. We have those four horsemen, and we have the representation of the earthquake, and the sun and moon being darkened, and all these different things that are happening. All of this representing judgment that's coming. And it's not, as we talked about a little bit, it's not in this context specifically referring to the final judgment and the end of the world. What we're actually describing here is the judgment that's going to come, for lack of a better term, on the empire, on the world in a physical sense, even though the world's going to continue afterward, because of the sinfulness of just the world in general as it's going. We should be thinking in terms of the flood. We should be thinking in terms of Assyria and Babylon taking Israel and Judah into captivity. That's the kind of judgment we're talking about. We're not talking about world-ending judgment yet. We'll get there in terms of both the New Testament in general and even allusions to it in Revelation itself. But remember the overall focus of the book. He starts off the book by saying things that must shortly take place. So we're talking about this judgment, this judgment that's going to shake the foundations of how things are established on earth. But we're talking about that in terms of what we might refer to, Americans are kind of familiar with this, right, as the establishment, right? We're talking about overturning the systems that are in place and all those kind of things. In this case, ultimately, we're talking about the unraveling of the Roman Empire and everything that's going to go along with that in large part. So we've been talking about that in chapters 5 and 6 especially, really building up to this idea of judgment. But then we kind of have this little intermission at the beginning of chapter 7, as we talked about last week. We have this depiction of the four angels at the four corners of the earth. Think north, south, east, and west, right? No one actually thought, even in ancient times, that the earth was a square. They thought it was a circle that was flat, yes, but they didn't think it was a square. So we're not talking about the Bible talking about a flat earth here. So we have the four angels at the four corners of the earth, north, south, east, and west, and they're holding back these winds. The winds, again, another representation of this judgment. But they're holding it back. We've got to pause for a second before this judgment is fully unleashed, because we've got to take those who are sealed out of the picture. Not completely out of the picture. They're still going to have to endure some of the hardships that are coming on the earth, but there needs to be a clear distinction between those who are sealed by God and those who are not. And so essentially what we have, we talked about, the 144,000 being 12 times 12, this number of God's people times 1,000, big numbers, right, and all these kinds of things. And we talked about how all of that together, we're using Israelite, Old Testament terminology to represent God's people, the ones who are set apart. But then we even extend it, and we see a multitude beyond number from every nation and tribe and people and tongue. And they are all invited to be part of this as well. So essentially what we came down to at the end of last week's class is that before this judgment occurs, again, we're talking specifically here about the judgment that's going to happen in their day and time, although this still in principle would apply to the final judgment. But before that judgment occurs that's about to happen in the world, everyone's going to have a chance to be part of those who are set apart. Everyone's going to have a chance, if you will, going again back to Exodus metaphors. We're going to see that even more in the next couple of chapters. Everyone's going to have a chance to have their doorposts sprinkled with the blood, right? So that the judgment will pass over them, at least in the broadest terms. So that's kind of the theme that we have here. All of these people being sealed by God, being set apart, so that there is this distinction between those who are about to face the judgment and those who have something much better to look forward to. So let's continue on then, because as I said, we're going to spend a little bit of time here this morning. There's a specific theme we need to understand as we kind of wrap up this initial discussion of this 144,000. Then, after this scene where everyone's worshiping God and thankful because of all those who are sealed, everyone's been invited, then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these clothed in white robes, and where have they come from?" If you remember, all of these who are sealed, they have the seal of God on their foreheads, and I believe they also have on their wrists. I think that's here, that may be later as well. But they have those seals, but they also are clothed in white robes, representing, as we talked about a lot, purity, innocence. But he asks, who are these, and where have they come from? Who is it that's asking John this? Let's start there. We have one of the elders. Who elders? Let's refresh our memory a little bit. Who is that? Who is in the throne room of God in the initial scene as we begin the visions of Revelation? Okay. You have 24 elders, right? And then 4 living creatures. We talked about the 4 living creatures, providence, and representing God's involvement in mankind and the physical universe. But we have these 24 elders representing the leadership of the God's people under the Old Covenant, the leadership of God's people under the New Covenant, 12 tribes, 12 apostles. And he is the one, or one of them, one of these leaders of God's people in this vision is the one who asks, who are these clothed in white robes, and from where have they come? Who are they? Before we go on and allow that to be answered, I suspect we kind of see what's coming. Who are the ones who are clothed in white robes? We have a vision relating to God's people, and we have people in the vision, a group of people who are sealed on their foreheads with the sign of God and are wearing white robes. Who are they? Okay. These are faithful Christians, right? This is just a very clear symbol that's used throughout Revelation. These are faithful Christians that we're talking about. I don't think John is necessarily confused about that. The next part of the question is what's interesting. From where have they come? Now, we have this description already earlier in the chapter. They come from all languages and peoples and tribes and nations, but that's not really what the elder seems to be asking, right? They come from everywhere. That's not really... that doesn't make sense for him to ask it that way. So let's keep going. I said to him, this is John, "Sir, you know," just a little piece of wisdom that John's giving us. If you ever happen to be in a vision and you're shown stuff and you're confused, don't try and guess. Just say, "I don't know," right? I'm not saying any of us will ever actually experience this. It's funny to me how he expresses this. He doesn't know exactly, and even if he thinks he knows, it's better to just have him tell you, right? "Sir, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." All right. If we take this verse and just yank it out of the Bible and read it by itself, we'd probably have a lot of questions, right? What is this great tribulation? But if we leave it in the context of everything we've been talking about for the last 7 chapters, what is this great tribulation?
Worship of the Roman emperors.
Okay. It's everything that the Asian Christians have been enduring in this period of history because of their faith. Revolving around, as Ralph said, this pressure for them to conform specifically to the worship of the imperial cult and everything that would involve as it permeated their culture. Again, we've talked about before, just a quick refresher. Remember, there are these very strong political and economic forces in Asia in particular because of their unique relationship with Rome. The leadership, political leadership of Asia is pushing allegiance to Rome and the emperor as demonstrated by the worship of these dead emperors in what's called the imperial cult. That permeated every aspect of politics, of social life, of business and trade guilds. You don't get to not participate in those practices without sticking out like a sore thumb. And there is an intense amount of persecution, not always violent, although some of it was, but there's an intense amount of persecution ranging everywhere from being ostracized socially, losing your job and not having any prospect of finding one later, all the way to literally being martyred. That whole spectrum is happening right now to the Christians who are living in Asia specifically. And so, in context, it becomes very, very clear what we're talking about here. This is not some strange period of time that's going to happen in our future. This is not some mystical time period that is depicted in popular movies like Left Behind or something like that. This isn't mysterious at all if we just read it as part of the book of Revelation. It's very clear. This is the tribulation, the trouble, the hardship that is being experienced by those who are trying to be faithful Christians in the midst of this kind of persecution, as Jesus is telling John to reveal to these Christians. I know what's going on for you. I know what's going on in your lives right now. Let me give you a bigger picture so that you understand better your situation from the perspective of heaven. These ones who are sealed, these ones who have the white robes, these are the ones coming out of the Great Tribulation. In other words, think back to the letters to the 7 churches, right? What does he constantly say? Don't compromise. Be faithful unto death. The one who conquers will be given the crown of victory, right? All of those allusions to be faithful, no matter how hard, no matter how much tribulation you have to go through, be faithful. And now we're pulling back the curtain more and more as we see this is what the faithful will have to enjoy. They are set apart. They are marked with the mark of God himself. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. They are not participating. They are not compromising. They are not trying to have Christ and the world both at the same time. They, as paradoxical as it is, have cleansed themselves with blood. I know we've talked about this illustration many, many times. What is probably the toughest stain to remove from clothing? It's blood stains, right? I've tried it a couple times and I'm no expert, but it's hard. And yet, again, this paradox, this very intentional paradox, the blood of the Lamb, that sacrifice, is what has gained victory, not only for Jesus Christ himself, as he gained victory over sin as God. We've talked about that a little bit on Wednesday nights, right? But he's also gained victory for those who will follow him. All right. So we have this vision, right? This depiction. We have this vision, this depiction of these people who are set apart, and John is being told they've made it through this time period, and they have been faithful. That's how they made it through. They've been faithful to Christ and not compromised. But he's going to give us a little more detail now, right? For then there will be a great tribulation, or will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Hold up now. This isn't actually Revelation, is it? This sounds like we could just be continuing reading Revelation, but where is this? This is Matthew 24. What are we talking about in this section of Matthew 24? Anybody know? I'll give you a hint. Jesus says in this section of Matthew 24, this generation will not pass away. Talking about the generation that is living and breathing, standing in front of him. This generation will not pass away until all this has been fulfilled. What is he talking about in this first part of Matthew 24? It's the destruction of Jerusalem. Why is he describing the destruction of Jerusalem this way? Why did the destruction of Jerusalem happen?
There was a revolt.
Okay, good. There was a revolt. Let's think in even broader terms. From God's point of view, why did the destruction of Jerusalem happen in 70 AD? Because the Jews rejected Christ. And there was judgment as a result. Now, not all Jews, of course. We understand many did convert. But for those who held on to what they wanted to be true, Jesus prophesied, just like the Assyrians, the Babylonians. Again, you see how much we're coming back to these symbols that were, or these events that were used in the Old Testament and using that symbolism here in the New Testament. Just like the Assyrians and the Babylonians brought judgment because of Israel's sins, because of the sins of God's people, there's coming one more judgment. But this one won't be like any other one that has come either before or since. Now, that's not to say there aren't horrific wars and battles and sieges and so forth that have happened in history that we could compare to Jerusalem. That's not the point. The point is the level of judgment that's being brought on this particular people in this particular way because of their response to something that God has done. So I want us to go back then. In light of this idea of judgment, we have a great tribulation. Why is there coming this great tribulation? Well, ultimately, it's the precursor, once again, to God's judgment, which is exactly what these seals, and later on we're going to have bowls and trumpets, all of these things are telling us of the judgment that is coming, in this case, not on God's former people, if you will, but now we're talking about on the known world because of their treatment of God's people. All right. We're not focused yet on the judgment, though, in this text. When you think about running a race, Paul uses this analogy. It's always, in any context, whether it's specifically a race like a marathon or something like that, or really any kind of event where people are competing or where people are trying to accomplish something, it's always so much fun to watch their faces at this point when they're about to cross or they are crossing the finish line. I don't know if you can see, but he just broke the ribbon right there. Why is it so meaningful at this point? Yes, but success after what? Okay. Again, I think I've told you all before, my dad used to run like cross-country, marathon type, stuff when he was in high school and a little bit in college. I never want to do that. If you've ever tried to run any longer than like a mile or two, it's just excruciating, right? I think the longest I ever ran was maybe, it might have been like 10-ish, something like that, miles or something. That was when I was like way younger and way more in shape, right? And I almost passed out. It's crazy. But you see people who build up to that, who are willing to put forth that effort, who are willing to invest that much in accomplishing this goal. And you see, as they cross the finish line, the culmination of all of that in their face. And you see it being worth it. Everything they've worked for, they finally it's finally panned out. It's finally helped them accomplish what they were trying to accomplish. What is God trying to tell us about these people who are set apart? Remember, they're coming out of the Great Tribulation. They are now wearing the white robes. They went through all this difficulty. They invested so much. They put themselves through so much. And now, as they're coming out of this difficult time, now they know they made it. Now, this is going to bring us to a very interesting question, as I mentioned before, kind of a theme that's going to run throughout. It's kind of been alluded to already, but it's going to run throughout a lot of the rest of the book. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Who are we talking about here? Okay, we're talking about the people with the robes. We're talking about the faithful Christians, right? Specifically, faithful Christians who have endured this particular time period in history and this particular place in this particular time period in history that was very difficult. They're before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. Where are they? I don't mean before the throne of God, right? We just said that. In our terms, where are they? Okay. I think that the knee-jerk response as we read this, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but I want us to discuss it. I think the knee-jerk response is, this is a description of heaven, right? They made it, now they get to enjoy their eternal reward beyond everything that's on this earth, right? Is there anything else this could be talking about? Okay, good. For the rest of the book, there are going to be several times where a reward for God's people is described in one way or another. Or, as Rowdy said, sometimes maybe more we could describe it as the relationship between God and his people are described. There are people who are going to go to Revelation, and they're going to very adamantly say that every time something like this is described, this is a vision of God's people in heaven. There are also going to be people who, every time something like this is described in the book of Revelation, are very adamantly going to insist that this is a description of the church and the relationship that the church has with God. Which is it? Okay, you've been taking a lot of tests, haven't you? I can relate. But I think Rowdy's onto something here. When we see a description like this, does it sometimes seem like the only way it could be accurate is if it's describing something in heaven? I think there are some times like that, and I think we're actually going to see one in the next couple verses. But going back to what he said just a second ago, the focus is on the relationship and the security that that relationship provides. That security exists simply by virtue of being one of God's people, whether we're on this side of eternity or that side. Now, there's a different level of security, I guess we could say, because I I can't mess it up, right? If I'm on the other side of eternity, for example, or I won't have to fight for it anymore when I'm on the other side of eternity, things like that, and we understand that. The point I want us to understand here is that a lot of times we try and pin it down really specifically. Is this the church? Is this heaven? I would argue that John, again through inspiration of course, I would argue that John is not trying to be quite that specific. I would argue that in general, he's describing the church, but he's describing the church at times in a general sense, and at times specifically in its perfected state, which would be in heaven. But the two overlap, because how could they not? If we're talking about the church and the relationship that the church has with God and the rewards that the church experiences because of their relationship with God, how could there not be some overlap between the blessings and the security and the joy that we experience as God's people here and on the other side of eternity? There is that both ways, right? So my point as we're looking at this, I would lean towards in this particular section, 15 through 17, the last 3 verses of this chapter, I would lean towards this being more of a description of the church in its perfected state, meaning in heaven, reaping their final reward. I would lean more towards that. But I want us to think, as we're going through both this section and the rest of the book, I want us to think in terms of the fact that Jesus is describing the blessing, Jesus through John, of course, all this through inspiration. He is describing the blessing of being God's people in general. He's not trying to nitpick, I want to talk about heaven here, I want to talk about the church in general here, I want to talk specifically about the church on earth here. I don't think he's really focused on that. He's giving us a picture. He's giving us a viewpoint, a way of thinking about ourselves as God's people and about what we're working towards. And so we see this, and yes, I think it can very, very accurately apply to Christians in heaven. I think many of the aspects that we're going to talk about in these 3 verses also very specifically apply to some of the blessings we have as God's people even before we get to heaven. Or at the very least, the hope that we have, that we're striving for, even while we're here, we have that hope until it's realized in heaven. It all is meant to kind of flow together into a whole. And so I want us to be thinking about it in those terms. This especially, fast forwarding just a little bit, this especially is going to come into play as we get towards the end of Revelation, right? When we see the marriage of Christ and the church, and we see all these different depictions, we have a representation of something there. And people try and kind of, I think, sometimes maybe pigeonhole it a little too much. We're being given a broad picture. So very briefly, we're almost out of time this morning, but I want us to see the principle, the concepts that are being given to us here. There's 3 things that John, in this vision, is being shown about what God's people will experience. And again, I would argue in its fullness, they will experience this in heaven. But I think that it even should be expanded beyond that in a sense. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. If we could describe what God's people are shown to be experiencing in this verse, if we just had to use one word, what might we throw out there? Protection, good. What else? Affection, good. Oh, perfection? Okay, good. I think you could say both, really, affection and perfection. What else? privilege. Anything come to mind when you think about the one on the throne sheltering them with his presence? The psalmist says, "Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings." This is actually a very common description, a common expression of relationship with God, even in the Old Testament. I can't help but think, as I read this, of how a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, even as Jesus describes that he wanted to do with the people of Jerusalem later on. But do we see kind of the imagery here? All of what y'all said, I think, is accurate. We have protection, we have shelter, we have privilege, we have love. And I would argue, going back to what we talked about just a couple of Wednesday nights ago, what we really see here at the deepest level is the idea of fellowship and relationship. Now, in its fullness, I would argue that is precisely what heaven is. Full, perfect fellowship with God. But even here on earth, as the church, we have this idea of connection, of relationship with God. So that's one of the descriptors that's given. Let's look at the next one.
Description of the tabernacle with the
Ah. Very good, very good. Ralph brought up another one. Remember the mercy seat of the tabernacle? We have these creatures, or whatever we want to call them. We could go into a whole tangent on that. But we have them with their wings spread over the mercy seat. And what dwells between the wings? The presence of God. Let's move on to verse 16. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. All right, again, if we're speaking about this literally, no, this could only be true in heaven. This couldn't be true on earth, right? Because there's still hunger and thirst and so forth. But even so, at least in principle, I think about Jesus when he goes out into the wilderness. He goes for 40 days and for 40 nights without food. And the first thing that the devil does is tempt him with food. And what is his response? Man shall not live by bread alone. It's not, even on this earth, as God's people, it's not that we may not hunger or thirst, it's that we know that that's not the real problem. That's not the real threat.
Paul he learned to be happy under any circumstance, whether it was
Yes.
hungry or tortured.
Yes. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound in all things. Wherever I am, I know how to be content. Yes. And so we see the same thing. Again, going back to the Psalms. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. Again, in a literal sense, we talked about a lot in Proverbs, that's not always literally true, but we're defining a principle here. And we're defining a principle that ultimately does point towards the eternal reward. And so even though, contrary to what the Jews, for example, thought at this time, just because you're rich doesn't mean God's happy with you. But those who do follow God, who God is happy with, are promised blessing and bounty beyond anything else. Last one. For the Lamb is in the midst of the throne, who is in the midst of the throne, will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. That one should ring a bell, right? The living water, the shepherd. Lord is my shepherd. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. What are we describing here? Ultimately, we're describing provision, guidance, safety, again, protection. Once again, are there still tears for us while we're here on this earth? Well, yes. Ultimately, in its fullness, in its literal sense, this again will not be fully realized until heaven. But even as we look forward to that, even as we do grieve here on this earth, we still have this sense that we're working towards something beyond that. So what do we see then as we wrap up chapter 7? Life as a Christian won't be easy. The Christians in Asia at this time understood that better than anyone. But all who accept salvation, remember this offer that's being made to everyone before the judgment comes, all who accept it will be blessed with fellowship, deliverance, and peace. And if we understand what that truly means, what's truly being offered, as they did, it's worth every sacrifice that may be put to us. Any thoughts before we close for this morning? Thank you all so much.